I've heard plenty of stories about infidelity before, but I never imagined I'd find myself in the middle of one. I still can't wrap my head around how it all happened. My wife and I have always been financially secure. She's never lacked for anything. Nice clothes, exotic vacations, the works. Our sex life seemed solid, or at least, that's what I thought. But now, it turns out she's been unfaithful, and I feel utterly betrayed. So where did everything go wrong? How did this all start? Honestly, random moments and seemingly insignificant encounters have always played a major role in shaping my life. They've opened doors, led to career breakthroughs, and introduced me to people who changed everything. And as it turns out, it was one of those moments that unraveled my whole world. It was during my lunch break. I was just out walking around the city, trying to clear my head, when I unknowingly turned toward a restaurant nearby. And what do I see? My wife, sitting there with her ex, laughing and talking like they hadn't just been part of my life years ago. I froze. My heart seemed to stop for a second, and all of a sudden, the ground felt like it was slipping out from under me. A mix of shock, anger, and hurt surged through me. It took me a moment to snap out of it. I knew I couldn't just sit there and stew about it. I needed answers. Now, I rushed back to my office, trying to calm myself down enough to make it through the rest of the day. The minutes dragged on as I waited, each one feeding my anxiety. By the time the workday ended, I'd managed to pull myself together, but I was still burning with the need to confront her. But how? How do I approach this? Do I just confront her head-on and accuse her outright? I mean, what if it was some coincidence, like she just happened to bump into her ex while they were both at the same restaurant? But then again, why the hell would she be across town, miles away from home? I was flooded with questions. I had to figure out the right way to get to the truth. Finally, the day came to a close, and I found myself driving home in a daze. I was so lost in thought that I didn't even realize how much time had passed. Before I knew it, I was parked outside our house, sitting in the car, taking a breath. It felt like I was gearing up for some kind of battle. As soon as I stepped inside, she wrapped her arms around me, just like always. But this time, I pulled away gently. I didn't want to do anything that felt normal. I headed straight for the kitchen, where I always asked for a cup of coffee after a long day. Without skipping a beat, she started making it, acting like nothing was wrong. I couldn't help myself. I asked how her day had gone. She looked me right in the eye and told me she'd spent it shopping with friends, picking up a couple of new blouses. Her lie hit me like a slap. No guilt, no hesitation, just a smooth, rehearsed story. I was floored. How could she lie so effortlessly, as if I didn't know her at all? It was almost impressive, if it weren't so devastating. And right then, I knew I needed more. I needed solid evidence. The next morning, I quietly snuck outside, grabbed the keys to her car, and set up a recorder in a spot where it wouldn't be found. I had to know for sure. After a quiet breakfast together, I went to work, trying to focus, but still consumed by the thought of what I might find on that recorder. The days passed in a blur, and I almost managed to push it all from my mind. But the weekend was on the horizon, and I knew what I had to do. Saturday morning, I sat down with the recorder, my hands shaking as I played it back. And there it was, the confirmation. My worst fears were true. Not only was she meeting with her ex, but during a recent company event, she drunkenly flirted with not one, but two of her colleagues. The weight of the truth crashed over me like a tidal wave. I could barely breathe. There was no more room for doubt. Now I had to decide. What next? What should I do? I couldn't live with this betrayal. I couldn't just brush it under the rug and pretend like nothing had happened. But I didn't just want to walk away. No, I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. She needed to understand the cost of her actions. So I began to plan. I wasn't going to let her get off scot-free. I was going to make her pay. But how? Revenge. That's what I needed. Revenge, in a way that would make her realize the depth of her mistake. I decided to take the day off from work. I had a plan, and it involved a trip. A trip to the small town where her father lived. Let me introduce you to a truly remarkable man. A man who once served as a general and devoted his entire life to his country. When I say this, I mean for a reason. This man devoted himself wholeheartedly to the service of the nation. I got to know him well over the years, especially when I was looking after his daughter, who later became my wife. Our paths often crossed when we took care of her or participated in various activities, such as visiting his bathhouse. The general took incredible care of his daughter, strictly controlling her life. Her freedom was severely limited, and she spent most of her time traveling between school and home. I can't help but wonder if this very strictness played a role in her rebellious nature when we got married. She felt the need to break free, explore and communicate more than she had ever been allowed. When I found out about her actions, I realized that I had to act. I didn't want to be the one to expose her, but I felt it was only a matter of time before her father found out about it. And the general, with his strict discipline, would most likely have reacted sharply. Perhaps I overestimated his reaction, but knowing his character, I couldn't help but feel that the situation could dramatically escalate if the truth came out. When I finally met him face to face, he was stunned at first. For a moment, I thought that perhaps because of his age, he was unable to bear the shock. But to my surprise, he handled it with the calmness of a soldier who had seen everything in his lifetime. Without saying a word, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and drained it in one gulp. He repeated this action 2 more times, and then, without saying another word, he simply left the room. It was at that moment that I realized it was time for me to leave. Now, as for how I handled my wife's betrayal, don't worry, nothing violent or extreme happened. I simply shared the truth with her, and the consequences followed naturally. She was soon out of the family home, finding herself with nowhere else to turn. Thankfully, we had no children, so the separation was more straightforward than it could have been. I remained calm throughout the entire process. I packed up all of her belongings, carefully placed them by the door, and without flinching, watched her silently observe the unraveling of her life. The coldness in my gaze, I suppose, conveyed everything that needed to be said. There was no need for shouting, no need for drama. She saw the seriousness of the situation, and she knew it was over. In truth, I didn't create a big scandal. I realized that for my wife, the biggest loss wouldn't be emotional. It would be the material comforts I provided. And so, everything she had taken for granted for so many years was suddenly gone. You see, I had made sure, years earlier, that we signed a prenuptial agreement. As a seasoned lawyer, I prepared for the worst. And when the worst came, she found herself without access to any of the things she'd grown so accustomed to. This, I suppose, became her true punishment. A year later, I happened to run into a mutual acquaintance who had known my ex-wife. Naturally, I asked about her, curious to know what had become of her after everything. To my surprise, I learned that her father had disowned her. He'd kicked her out of his house and cut off all contact. She was now living with a man on the outskirts of her hometown in what could only be described as humble, even impoverished conditions. And on social media. Well, my ex-wife claims that I ruined her life. She paints me as the villain in her story, calling me a terrible person for everything that transpired. But I know the truth. She was the one who chose this path, and in the end, she reaped what she had sown.